What if the most feared rituals of the ancient world were never meant to be witnessed by ordinary eyes, yet shaped entire civilizations from the shadows? Imagine standing at the threshold of a forbidden chamber, the air thick with incense, the stone walls echoing with chants meant only for the priests of Baal. This is where the boundaries of faith, fear, and power blurred, where sacred duty transformed into something far more punishing and far more manipulative than the chronicles dare to admit. When you picture ancient religion, you might imagine devotion, offerings, and ceremonial dances. But behind the public altars, another world existed, a world crafted to control minds, bend wills, and test the limits of human endurance. And it all began with one chilling principle. Nothing belonged to the priests except their God, and nothing belonged to their God except what was taken through pain. To understand the cruelty of these secret rituals, you must picture the psychology behind them. The priests did not simply perform rites, they ruled through awe, fear, and spectacle. They mastered the art of turning spiritual authority into emotional submission. The deeper you look, the more you realize how every gesture, every word spoken in the dark, was designed to imprint obedience. They created a system where silence was sacred, where suffering was a path to purification, and where any hesitation was seen as betrayal. And yet, this harsh environment did not repel followers. It fascinated them. Those who sought guidance believed that by surrendering to the priests, they could unlock protection, prosperity, or divine favor. The priests knew this well and used it to elevate their status beyond that of simple religious figures. They became judges of fate, keepers of knowledge, and orchestrators of punishment. What you are about to uncover goes far beyond myth or legend. These rituals were more than ceremonies. They were psychological frameworks built to dominate. They pushed initiates to confront their deepest fears, and in doing so, made them easier to mold. But where does devotion end and cruelty begin? And how much suffering can be justified in the name of the divine? You may have felt at some point in your life the weight of authority pressing on your choices, shaping your path, guiding you towards something you never questioned. You ever experienced that? Because what the priests of Baal perfected was the ability to make people believe that submission was sacred and that endurance was a privilege. As you follow this journey, stay with me until the end, because what you discover next may reshape how you see ancient faith. Before we go deeper, tell me your impressions so far. Leave a comment sharing what this opening made you feel. Drop a like to support this work, and check if you are already subscribed to the channel, because understanding these hidden forces matters. And now, as we move forward, another layer of this shadowed world begins to surface, preparing the ground for what comes next. The deeper you step into the hidden chambers of Baal's devoted elite, the clearer it becomes that their authority did not come merely from ritual performance, but from a pact that demanded absolute surrender of body, mind, and identity. This pact was not written on clay tablets or carved into temple walls. It was engraved directly into the psyche of every initiate. From the moment a novice crossed the threshold, he understood that his life was no longer his own. The priests believed that true power required sacrifice not only from the worshippers who sought Baal's favor, but from themselves as instruments of divine will. Yet this sacrifice had a darker dimension, one carefully masked under the language of sacred duty. Every initiate was required to undergo a silent oath, an inner vow that bound him to the temple with a force stronger than chains. The ritual demanded that he renounce all attachments, from family to personal ambition, sealing the renunciation with a symbolic offering of blood. This offering was not designed to inflict serious harm, but to mark the body with a reminder. Nothing in the priest's life would remain untouched by the temple's demands. The initiates were isolated for days, surrounded by chanting, flickering torchlight, and the unyielding gaze of elder priests who watched for any sign of hesitation. In this environment, obedience was not a choice. It was a condition of survival. The psychological pressure embedded in these practices served a purpose far beyond spiritual discipline. By stripping the priests of their former identity, the hierarchy ensured they could be rebuilt into instruments of unquestioned loyalty. Their speech, their posture, even the way they breathed was trained to mirror the solemnity of the order. Step by step, they were shaped into figures who could inspire both devotion and dread. And as they progressed, they were exposed to teachings that blurred the line between mystical insight and manipulative doctrine. They learned how to command attention, how to draw fear from silence, how to read the emotional vulnerabilities of those who came seeking guidance. These techniques became tools as sacred as any offering placed upon the altar. The pact of blood also served another purpose, one rarely acknowledged in surviving accounts. It tightened the internal bonds of the clergy, creating a network of shared guilt, shared sacrifice, and shared secrecy. Anyone who contemplated leaving the order carried the knowledge that he had already crossed boundaries society would not forgive. This was how the temple maintained its core of loyal practitioners, turning fear into faith, discipline into dependency. The priests believed that through this complete surrender of the self, they were granted access to the deeper forces that governed the cosmos. Whether these forces were divine or psychological mattered little. What truly mattered was the authority the pact allowed them to wield. As the initiates moved further through the ranks, they discovered that the blood oath was only the first step in a system designed to test their endurance, obedience, and willingness to impose these same trials on others. And the next set of rituals, hidden even from many within the priesthood, revealed the true extent of the temple's power. What awaited them behind the obscured corridors would expose the harshest dimensions of Baal's sacred dominion, shaping the future of every ceremony performed under the shadow of the temple's towering columns. Once a priest had surrendered to the oath of blood, he entered a realm where discipline was no longer symbolic, but deeply physical and psychological. The temples of Baal were not merely places of worship filled with fragrance and chants. They were environments engineered to maintain strict internal order. Behind the grand public altars, far from the crowds who saw only spectacle and devotion, existed a narrow system of penalties designed to extinguish dissent before it took root. These punishments were not spoken of openly, not even among the lower ranks of the clergy, for the strength of the hierarchy depended on their secrecy as much as on their severity. Through these hidden rituals of correction, the priests reinforced the idea that obedience was not simply expected, but unavoidable. The first form of punishment was isolation, a practice masked as sacred contemplation. A disobedient novice could be confined for days in a dark chamber, with only the echo of distant chants seeping through the stone. In this space, the mind became both tormentor and test. The darkness pressed against the senses, forcing the individual to confront fears he did not know he carried. What seemed like meditation soon revealed itself as psychological erosion, a deliberate stripping of resistance. By the time the novice was released, his silence was deeper, his gaze more compliant, and his will softened for reshaping. This was the temple's first lesson. Resistance was a burden, but obedience brought clarity. More severe transgressions demanded a ritual of physical endurance. These were not brutal beatings or tortures meant to maim, but carefully crafted ceremonies framed as purification. The initiate might be required to kneel for hours on cold stone floors, repeating sacred recitations while elder priests observed his posture, breath, and control. Any sign of fatigue was met with another layer of ritual pressure. This ordeal taught the body to yield to spiritual authority, while teaching the elders how far each novice could be pushed before breaking. The ritual was a measurement of devotion, a tool to separate strong candidates from those whose resolve would not survive the inner demands of the temple. But the most feared punishment of all was the ritual of mirrored judgment. This was reserved for those who questioned doctrine or hesitated during sacred practices. The offender was brought before the elders in a chamber lit by a single flame. Here, he was required to recount his transgression in detail, then reenact the moment of doubt through symbolic gestures. The ritual forced the initiate to confront not only his error, but the emotional root behind it. This confrontation was a psychological tightening, a reminder that even thoughts carried weight within the temple. The shame generated in this ritual lingered long after the ceremony ended, embedding itself as a silent guardian against future disobedience. These punishments were part of a larger framework designed to mold the clergy into instruments of the temple's will. They ensured that those who remained within the order were not merely obedient, but deeply conditioned, their minds shaped as carefully as the stone pillars that held the temple aloft. Yet, despite the harshness, many priests accepted these trials not as cruelty, but as spiritual discipline, convinced that Baal required unwavering commitment. What they did not yet understand was that these punishments were only the surface of a deeper tradition. Beyond the chambers of correction lay rituals so secretive and so psychologically intense that even seasoned priests approached them with a mixture of devotion and dread, knowing that the true inner workings of Baal's priesthood still awaited discovery. Among all the practices hidden behind the temple's massive stone walls, none evoked more fear than the silent ritual reserved for those deemed ready to face the deepest mysteries of Baal. Unlike other ceremonies marked by chants, incense, and coordinated movements, this ritual drew its power from absolute stillness. The initiate was led into a chamber carved deep beneath the temple, where the air felt older than the building itself. There were no torches, no symbols etched into the walls, no visible signs of divine presence. The absence of sound and sight was intentional, meant to strip away every external anchor and force the initiate inward. It was within this void that the priests believed true communion with Baal began. The ritual demanded that the initiate remain motionless for hours, surrounded by the presence of elder priests who did not speak, did not move, and did not intervene. The silence grew heavier with each passing moment, settling against the mind like a weight that could not be lifted. Deprived of sensory guidance, the initiate began to feel the boundaries of self blur. Some described the sensation as floating. Others felt as though they were sinking deeper into unseen layers of consciousness. The stillness became a mirror, reflecting fears, desires, and memories normally buried beneath daily rituals. This confrontation with the inner world was one of the most psychologically intense trials within the priesthood. The purpose of this ritual was not to punish, but to expose. The elders watched for subtle reactions, for changes in breathing, posture, or tension. These details revealed how prepared the initiate truly was. Those who faced the silence without breaking were believed to have reached a state of spiritual alignment that allowed them to carry the temple's hidden knowledge. But for many, the silence became unbearable. Some felt as if unseen presences circled them in the darkness, whispering accusations that were never spoken aloud. Others became overwhelmed by their own doubts, convinced that Baal himself was testing their worthiness. In truth, the ritual was designed to push their minds to the edge, for only at that edge could the order measure the initiate's resilience. When the ritual finally ended, it ended abruptly. A single sound, a soft tapping against stone, would break the stillness. To the initiates, it felt like being pulled up from deep water, everything suddenly sharp and real again. Some emerged stronger, their expressions marked by calm determination. Others stumbled, shaken by what they had faced within themselves. The elders never spoke about what occurred during the ritual, nor did they offer comfort. The silence was meant to teach that spiritual power required not only discipline, but the courage to confront one's hidden weaknesses. As the initiates advanced deeper into the hierarchy of Baal's priesthood, they eventually encountered a ceremony whispered about even among seasoned members, a ritual described publicly as a symbolic offering but privately understood to hold a far darker purpose. This ritual was performed in a secluded courtyard within the temple complex, where a single stone altar rested beneath an opening in the ceiling, allowing moonlight to fall directly upon it. Official doctrine claimed that the ceremony reenacted Baal's dominion over the cycles of life and death, a reminder that all things must be surrendered before they can be renewed. Yet those who participated learned quickly that the ritual was less about cosmological harmony and more about psychological domination. The reader, symbolic sacrifice did not involve harm to living beings, at least not in the physical sense. Instead, each initiate was required to bring an object representing something deeply personal, something tied to identity, memory, or ambition. This object became the focus of the ritual, held aloft by the elders as they recited incantations meant to sever the initiate as completely as possible from what the object represented. To an outsider, this might seem like a simple ceremony of letting go, but within the context of the priesthood, it served as a calculated psychological maneuver. The elders chose their words carefully, guiding the initiate into a state of emotional vulnerability, pressing them to reveal inner fears under the guise of spiritual cleansing. What made this ritual particularly unsettling was the way it reframed personal loss as divine necessity. The initiate was told that Baal accepted only offerings that carried true emotional weight, and that anything less would be considered an affront. This pressure forced initiates to confront attachments they had long suppressed, and the act of surrender became a moment of exposure. The elders watched intently, not simply to judge devotion, but to gather insight into the initiate's psychological state. Every tremor in the voice, every hesitation, every flicker of regret became information used to guide future trials. In this way, the ritual became a tool for mapping the vulnerabilities of each priest, ensuring that the hierarchy always understood the internal weaknesses of those beneath them. The object itself was never returned. Once offered, it was placed into a sealed chamber beneath the altar, a physical reminder that the initiate had crossed another threshold with no possibility of turning back. The loss lingered long after the ceremony ended, shaping behavior and reinforcing submission. Many initiates described the aftermath as a mixture of emptiness and clarity, a sensation the elders interpreted as spiritual alignment, but which, in reality, mirrored the emotional effects of controlled detachment. By removing pieces of the priest's former identities, the temple tightened its grip on their inner lives, ensuring that their sense of self became inseparable from their role within the order. This ritual also served a broader function in the hierarchy's long-term strategy. It prepared initiates for the more intense ceremonies that awaited them, ceremonies where the line between symbolic, sacrifice, and psychological torment would blur even further. The elders understood that the mind, once stripped of its anchors, became both more malleable and more dependent on external authority. And as the initiates progressed, they began to sense that the symbolic offering was only the start of a path leading toward rites that demanded far greater personal unraveling. Beyond the courtyard, deeper into the restricted chambers of the temple, the next stage awaited, cloaked in secrecy and designed to test the limits of spiritual obedience. For those who dared to resist the expectations of the priesthood, the Temple of Baal held a category of punishments far more severe than the earlier trials of silence or isolation. These were not framed as acts of cruelty, but as necessary corrections for the preservation of sacred order. The elders insisted that the stability of the temple depended on unwavering obedience, and anyone who threatened that structure needed to be reshaped before their doubt could spread. In this sense, the torment imposed on disobedient priests functioned both as discipline and as a powerful deterrent, a reminder to every initiate that deviation carried a heavy cost. The first stage of this punishment was public exposure within the inner ranks. The offender was brought before a circle of priests who recited passages highlighting the severity of his transgression. Although outsiders never witnessed these proceedings, the ritual humiliation marked the individual as someone whose loyalty had come into question. He was required to stand in complete stillness while hearing every accusation spoken in a calm, ceremonial tone. The purpose was not to incite rage or fear, but to generate a deep internal fracture, a sense that he had betrayed a force greater than himself. This psychological blow weakened the will, making the offender more susceptible to the next stage of correction. Following this, the priest was led to a chamber known informally as the Hall of Burdens. Here, symbolic weights were placed on his arms and shoulders, forcing him to maintain strenuous postures for extended periods. The elders claimed the ritual represented the burden of spiritual responsibility, but its true function was physical exhaustion paired with emotional strain. As the hours passed, the offender's body trembled under the pressure, and his mind began to unravel. This ordeal pushed the individual to confront the consequences of defiance, making obedience feel not only safer, but necessary for survival within the order. Yet the most profound aspect of this torment came not from physical endurance, but from enforced reflection. After the Hall of Burdens, the priest was confined to a dim cell with only a single oil lamp. On the wall, symbols carved by earlier offenders flickered in the shifting light, each mark a testament to moments of personal collapse. The offender was ordered to remain awake, reciting passages that reaffirmed devotion until exhaustion blurred the boundaries of thought. In this vulnerable state, priests often experienced visions shaped by guilt, fear, and the psychological imprint of the temple's teachings. Whether these visions were spiritual or self-generated mattered little. They reinforced the idea that Baal's presence hovered constantly over the minds of his servants. The final stage of correction was an audience with the elders. Unlike earlier reprimands, this meeting relied on measured silence. The elders observed the offender's posture, expression, and breath, evaluating whether the ritual had achieved the desired submission. If they sensed lingering resistance, the cycle could repeat, each round pushing the individual deeper into compliance. Those who emerged from this process often displayed an eerie calm, their earlier doubts erased or buried beneath layers of ritual conditioning. They returned to their duties with renewed intensity, driven not by faith alone, but by the memory of the torment they had endured. What many initiates did not realize was that this system of punishment served another purpose. It taught the clergy how to wield authority through psychological mastery. By understanding how to break and rebuild one of their own, the elders refined the techniques they used to influence followers outside the temple. And as the hierarchy grew stronger, the rituals awaiting the highest ranks became even more secretive, revealing that the darkest practices of Baal's priesthood were still hidden beyond these chambers. Among the many hidden layers of Baal's priesthood, there existed one ceremony so carefully protected that even seasoned initiates spoke of it only in fragments. This ritual, reserved exclusively for the highest-ranking elders, was known within the inner circle as the threshold of the veil. It represented the culmination of decades of submission, discipline, psychological conditioning, and unwavering service to the temple. Those deemed worthy to participate were not chosen for devotion alone, but for their complete internal alignment with the order's most sacred and most dangerous principles. To the outer world, these elders appeared serene and authoritative, but within the temple walls, they carried the weight of knowledge that few minds could bear without fracturing. The ceremony took place in a hidden chamber carved beneath the oldest section of the temple complex. Access to this chamber required passage through a narrow corridor, marked by fractured symbols, remnants of a language predating the current priesthood. The chamber itself was illuminated by a dim, pulsating glow, produced by bowls of smoldering resin that released a thick, aromatic smoke. Participants described the air as heavy, almost alive, as though the room itself breathed alongside them. This environment was deliberately crafted to disorient the senses, opening the mind to impressions that blurred the line between external stimulus and internal vision. During the ceremony, the elders formed a circle around a central stone platform that contained carvings too worn to be interpreted. One by one, each elder placed a hand upon the stone, closing their eyes as the leading priest chanted invocations in a slow, rhythmic cadence. These chants were believed to awaken ancestral forces tied to Baal, though modern observers might interpret them as tools for inducing a trance-like state. As the rhythm intensified, participants reported feeling their sense of individuality dissolve, replaced by a powerful impression of collective consciousness. The experience was described not as communion with a deity, but as immersion into a vast ancient presence that overshadowed their own. The purpose of this ritual was not simply reverence, it was alignment. Through this ceremony, the elders reaffirmed their unity as the governing mind of the temple, reinforcing the hierarchy that maintained control over the priesthood and its followers. The visions experienced during the ritual served as both revelation and reinforcement. Elders sometimes perceived symbols, shadowed figures, or whispered guidance that influenced future decisions. Whether these impressions originated from divine forces or from the psychological intensity of the environment, the outcome was the same. Participants emerged with renewed conviction that their authority was sanctioned by something beyond mortal comprehension. The threshold of the veil also functioned as a test. Any elder unable to withstand the weight of the visions risked losing their mental equilibrium. Some accounts speak of priests who faltered during the ritual, their minds overwhelmed by the torrent of imagery. These individuals were quietly removed from public duties under the guise of retreat or spiritual illness, but those within the inner circle knew the truth. The ceremony revealed not only power, but vulnerability, exposing fractures hidden even from the participants themselves. If you imagine witnessing such a ritual, what do you think would challenge you most? The darkness, the visions, or the weight of shared power? Leave a comment sharing your thoughts and impressions about this part of the story, and continue Comic while we go even deeper into the hidden structure of Baal's ancient priesthood. While the inner rituals shaped the minds of the priests themselves, the true influence of Baal's clergy extended far beyond the temple chambers. The priesthood wielded its greatest power not through divine miracles, but through an intricate system of psychological and spiritual manipulation that allowed them to steer entire communities. The faithful approached the temple seeking protection, prosperity, and guidance, unaware that each ritual, each prophecy, and each blessing had been carefully structured to keep them emotionally dependent on the priesthood. To the public, the priests appeared as intermediaries between mortals and the divine. In reality, they acted as architects of belief, designing experiences that shaped perception as precisely as a sculptor shapes stone. One of the most effective tools they used was ritual choreography. Every movement in a ceremony, every drum beat, every echo of repeated chants was engineered to evoke awe and vulnerability. The faithful often entered the temple with worries or unresolved fears, and the atmosphere amplified those emotions until people felt they were standing on the threshold of divine judgment. Once they were emotionally exposed, the priests stepped in as stabilizing forces, offering interpretations and reassurances that reframed the worshippers' experiences as signs of Baal's will. This dynamic created a cycle in which the faithful felt both humbled and protected, subtly reinforcing the idea that only through the clergy could they find equilibrium. Another layer of manipulation involved selective disclosure. The priests maintained a strict hierarchy of knowledge, revealing to the public only what strengthened their authority while withholding anything that might undermine it. Prophecies were often deliberately vague, allowing the priesthood to reinterpret outcomes in their favor. If a harvest failed, they claimed the people had not shown sufficient devotion. If it succeeded, they declared that Baal had rewarded their rituals. In either scenario, the faithful grew more reliant on the priests for interpretation. This dependency allowed the clergy to assume roles beyond spiritual, advisors, influencing trade, politics, and even disputes among families. Emotional triggers were also embedded into the daily practices of the temple. For example, worshippers were encouraged to confess personal fears to the priests, believing that doing so would cleanse the spirit or draw Baal's favor. These confessions gave the clergy deep insight into the vulnerabilities of their followers. By addressing these fears through rituals crafted to appear divine, the priests built personalized forms of influence that made individuals feel uniquely seen and protected. What people did not realize was that their deepest insecurities had become leverage points through which the priesthood strengthened its hold. The manipulation extended even to communal celebrations. Festivals honoring Baal were designed to evoke overwhelming gratitude and relief. The climax of these events often involved symbolic gestures performed by the priests, gestures that the public interpreted as sacred acts, sealing the community's future. This emotional intensity created lasting loyalty, binding the crowd to the temple not through fear alone, but through a sense of shared identity crafted by the clergy. These orchestrated experiences shaped memory and reinforced the idea that life outside the rituals was incomplete. Yet, for all the power embedded in these practices, their true purpose was hidden from the faithful. Each ritual served not only to honor Baal, but to sustain the structure that kept the priests at the top of societal hierarchy. And as the clergy refined their methods, they began integrating even more complex techniques drawn from ancient teachings reserved for inner circles. With these methods, they could influence not only behavior, but belief itself, preparing the population for the next evolution of the temple's authority, one rooted in deeper psychological foundations still concealed beneath the surface. As the influence of Baal's priesthood expanded, their authority began to intertwine with the political structures of the ancient cities they served. What started as spiritual leadership gradually evolved into a form of governance, where religious doctrine subtly directed the flow of power. City rulers sought alliances with the priesthood, not only to secure divine favor, but to gain access to the psychological tools that allowed the clergy to control and unify the population. Through this partnership, the temple and the palace became two halves of a single system, each reinforcing the other's control while concealing the darker practices that sustained their authority. One of the primary reasons political leaders valued the priesthood was its deep understanding of collective emotion. Priests knew how to manipulate fear, hope, and expectation, shaping public sentiment in ways that benefited those in charge. When a ruler wished to implement a controversial decision, the priests could frame it as a divine mandate, transforming resistance into reluctant acceptance. Conversely, when the population grew restless, the clergy could orchestrate displays of divine displeasure, using ritual symbolism to redirect public frustration away from political figures and toward supernatural forces. In this way, spiritual authority became a shield protecting the ruling class from the consequences of their own decisions. The partnership also allowed the priesthood to expand its own internal power. In exchange for supporting the ruler's agenda, the temple received resources, land, and exclusive rights to interpret divine will. These privileges enabled the priests to conduct their most secretive rituals without interference. Political leaders often suspected that the clergy engaged in practices not disclosed to the public, but they tolerated these mysteries as long as the priesthood continued to maintain social stability. The temple became an institution whose inner workings were known only to the highest levels of society, hidden behind layers of sacred law that discouraged inquiry. At the same time, the alliance created opportunities for the priesthood to influence political outcomes. Priests acted as advisors, interpreting omens, dreams, and celestial events in ways that guided rulers toward decisions advantageous to the temple. When a ruler lacked an heir, the priests might intervene with rituals promising fertility. When a military campaign loomed, they performed ceremonies predicting victory or warning of divine disfavor. Each interpretation subtly shaped political strategy, weaving the clergy's interests into the very structure of governance. Over time, rulers learned that defying the priesthood could provoke spiritual backlash, erode public support, and even weaken their legitimacy in the eyes of the population. Yet the most delicate aspect of this relationship lay in the sacred practices deemed too dangerous or too controversial for public knowledge. Some rituals conducted by the priesthood were believed to involve symbolic reenactments of cosmic battles, invoking forces that the clergy claimed only they could safely channel. Whether these rituals held genuine supernatural significance or served as psychological theater, they reinforced the perception that the priests possessed access to hidden realms of power. Political leaders, recognizing the value of this mystique, allowed the rituals to continue unchallenged, even when whispers of their severity reached the broader population. This interconnected web of political influence, spiritual authority, and concealed practices created a society where questioning the priesthood became nearly impossible. Those who attempted to challenge the system found themselves isolated, discredited, or quietly removed from positions of power. And as the centuries passed, the line between governance and worship blurred completely, preparing the ground for the final and most secretive revelation about the hidden consequences of Baal's sacred dominion, a revelation understood only by those who dared to look beyond the surface of divine authority. When examining the full scope of Baal's priesthood, it becomes clear that the rituals hidden behind temple walls did more than shape the clergy. They left a deep and lasting imprint on the society that surrounded them. The influence of these practices extended far beyond the boundaries of the sacred complex. subtly defining how people understood authority, morality, and human purpose. The reader, psychological systems crafted inside the temple were mirrored in everyday life, as families, merchants, rulers, and entire communities internalized the belief that suffering could be sacred, obedience could be virtuous, and secrecy could be a form of protection. These ideas became woven into the cultural fabric, shaping behavior long after individual rituals had faded from memory. What made this impact so enduring was the way the priesthood fused fear and fascination. The public knew only fragments of what occurred inside the temple, but those fragments were enough to establish a collective mythology. Whispers of silent trials, symbolic sacrifices, and hidden ceremonies elevated the clergy to an almost untouchable status. People did not simply respect the priests. They depended on them for stability in a world where the divine was seen as both protector and punisher. The mysterious nature of the rituals strengthened the belief that the priests alone could navigate forces too dangerous for ordinary minds. This perception granted them an authority that no king could match, an authority rooted not in visible power, but in the invisible currents of belief. Over generations, this dynamic produced a society where emotional and spiritual tension became normalized. Children grew up hearing stories of Baal's great demands. Merchants sought blessings before important transactions, and leaders hesitated to act without consulting the priesthood. Even simple events were interpreted through a ritualistic lens. A storm could signal divine displeasure. A successful harvest, divine favor. These interpretations reinforced the authority of the temple, establishing a cycle in which the rituals shaped the society, and the society, in turn, justified the rituals. It was a system designed not merely to control, but to perpetuate itself through culture, memory, and fear. But perhaps the most striking legacy of these hidden rites was the emotional imprint they left on individuals. For many, the rituals became a way of understanding personal struggle. Suffering was reframed as transformation, obedience as strength, and uncertainty as a sign of divine testing. These ideas influenced not only religious behavior, but interpersonal relationships, political decisions, and even concepts of justice. And though the physical temples eventually decayed, the psychological architecture remained, echoing across time in stories, traditions, and cultural patterns that carried traces of the ancient priesthood's design. If you have walked with me through every layer of this hidden world, you have seen how ritual, power, and belief intertwined to create something far more complex than simple worship. And if something in this exploration resonated with you, let that feeling guide your reflection as you consider how ancient systems of control still echo subtly in modern structures. If you reached this point, tell me in the comments by saying, "This message was for me," because I want to know who stayed with me until the end. If the depth of this content helped illuminate something new for you, leave a like to support the channel, and make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss the next exploration. There is another video waiting for you here, one that expands this journey even further. So click and continue with me while we uncover yet another story hidden beneath the surface of history.